There is a particular way that Americans work. If you have lived abroad and come back, you notice it within hours. It is not the pace exactly, though the pace is fast. It is the texture of the striving, a tightness in the jaw, a forward lean, a quality of urgency that attaches itself to even small tasks. Getting coffee feels like executing a mission. A commute feels like a competition. Conversation carries an undertone of performance, as if every exchange is an audition. William James noticed this in 1899, and he named it with the precision of a diagnostician: overtension. He called it the Great American Disease, and he prescribed a remedy so counterintuitive that his audiences laughed at first before they recognized themselves. James had spent years studying the body-mind relationship, and he had come to a conclusion that cut against every popular understanding of how effort works. He noticed that when Americans tried hard, really tried, with what they considered their full effort, they were wasting a significant portion of that effort in unnecessary muscular and psychic tension. They gripped their pens too hard. They scowled while doing arithmetic. They held their breath during difficult conversations. They tensed muscles that had no role in the task at hand. And this tension, far from improving performance, was actively degrading it. The energy spent on the grip, the scowl, the clenched jaw, that was energy that did not go into the thinking, the writing, the conversation. He traced this pattern to what he called the bottled lightning ideal of character, the American cultural preference for intensity, for visible striving, for the drama of effort. To be seen working hard was a moral virtue. Earnestness was next to godliness. The Puritan heritage had embedded in American culture a deep suspicion of ease, a belief that comfort and relaxation were the first steps towards sloth and then damnation. Even as Americans became less formally religious, they retained this structure, the sense that you should always be straining toward something, that relaxation was at best a brief reprieve earned by prior straining, never a state to cultivate in itself. The result, James argued, was a population chronically exhausted by effort that was not producing proportionate results, not because they were not smart or capable, but because they had never learned to work with their nervous system rather than against it. They were like someone trying to carry water by squeezing a sponge. The harder the grip, the less water reaches the destination. James's model of how the nervous system operates made this comprehensible. He knew, from his years of physiological research, that the body responds to stress by mobilizing energy. Muscles tighten. Blood pressure rises. Attention narrows. This is appropriate when you are being chased by something dangerous. It is catastrophically wasteful when you are writing a report or having a difficult conversation. The narrowing of attention that serves you in a crisis is the same narrowing that prevents the lateral thinking required for creative problem solving. The muscle tension that would help you fight or run actually degrades fine motor control and produces fatigue without any physical work to justify it. The gospel of relaxation, then, was not an invitation to do less. It was an invitation to do the same things with less resistance. James had been influenced by the religious and philosophical movement known as mind cure, which included the precursors to what we now call positive thinking and which had attracted large followings among Americans who felt the cultural pressure of overtension and were looking for relief. He was sympathetic to the experimental core of this movement even when he distrusted its metaphysical claims. What the mind curists had discovered through intuition and practice, James believed, could be given a scientific foundation. Relaxation was not a spiritual technique. It was a physiological skill with measurable effects on performance, health, and happiness. He recommended a series of practices, some of which sound strikingly modern. Speak more slowly. Let silences exist. Do not anticipate every possible problem. When you notice unnecessary tension, the clenched jaw, the hunched shoulders, the held breath, simply release it, without drama, without self-criticism, as many times as necessary. He recommended that people pay attention to the gap between the amount of effort a task requires and the amount they are actually expending, and practice bringing these two quantities into alignment. Most tasks require far less effort than we give them. The extra effort is not producing results. It is producing exhaustion and anxiety. This connects to a deep insight about the relationship between attention and performance. James was one of the first psychologists to study attention systematically, and he knew that voluntary attention, the effortful kind, the kind you deploy when you tell yourself to focus, is actually quite limited in its capacity and durability. The best kind of attention is what he called derived attention, or what we might call flow-like absorption, the state in which your attention is drawn to a task by genuine interest rather than driven by will. This kind of attention is actually easier to sustain, requires less metabolic cost, and produces better results. and it is almost impossible to access when you are over-tense, because the tension is itself a form of vigilance, a scanning for threats, that competes with the absorption required for flow. James made a specific observation about how Americans learn, which feels even more relevant now than it did in 1899. He noticed that American students were so anxious about their performance, so preoccupied with being seen to work hard, with meeting external standards, with avoiding failure, that they were preventing themselves from entering the states of absorption in which real learning happens. They were trying so hard to learn that they could not learn. The trying was getting in the way of the doing. Modern research has confirmed every aspect of this analysis with a precision James lacked. Studies on the relationship between arousal and performance have repeatedly shown an inverted U-curve. Performance increases with arousal up to a point and then deteriorates rapidly as tension exceeds an optimal level. The optimal level for complex cognitive tasks is significantly lower than the level most people maintain during their working hours. Studies on mindfulness, the practice of intentionally releasing unnecessary tension and returning attention to the present moment, have shown measurable improvements in cognitive performance, decision-making, emotional regulation, and physical health. The mechanisms James described intuitively are now documented in detail. But the gospel of relaxation is fighting against more cultural force today than it was in James's time. The past 2 decades have seen the rise of what can only be called hustle culture, an ideological glorification of overwork, sleep deprivation, and chronic urgency as markers of ambition and virtue. The language has changed from Puritan earnestness to entrepreneurial grinding, but the underlying psychology is identical, the belief that the quality of your striving can be measured by its visibility and its intensity, and that relaxation is what losers do. James would have recognized this immediately, and he would have said the same thing he said in 1899, "You are wasting enormous quantities of energy on tension that is producing no output except more tension. You are making yourself ill. And the saddest part is that you are not even getting better results." The most effective performers in any domain, athletes, musicians, surgeons, writers, share a capacity for what sports psychologists call relaxed concentration, the ability to bring full attention to a task while maintaining a physical and emotional baseline that does not waste energy on extraneous tension. This is a skill. It can be learned. It is not a personality trait, not a gift, not a byproduct of working less hard. It is something you practice, in the same way that James recommended, by noticing unnecessary tension and releasing it, repeatedly, without making the releasing into another form of effortful striving. Subscribe to The Psychology of William James to explore more of his timeless ideas.